The first news of the disaster was picked up by the Admiralty wireless station at Mount Pearl in a radio from the stranded ship. S.O.S. Florizel ashore near Cape Race. Fast going to pieces. The Evening Telegraph, St. John's, February 25th, 1918. The news was quickly communicated to the owners of the ship, who received the information around 5 a.m. And by 4 p.m., a relief train full of doctors, nurses, and medical supplies was on its way to the scene, as was a ship full of life-saving tools and Royal Naval Reservists with lifeboats. This had all taken time, though, in part because of conflicting messages that had been sent, and no one could get a hold of the Florizel by wireless any longer.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Florizel is behind time.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Florizel had been built for the New York, Newfoundland, and Halifax Steamship Company, better known as the Red Cross Line, or Newfoundland, Canada, in 1909. The ship had been specially constructed with the weather conditions that she would meet with sailing around Newfoundland in mind. She was expected to encounter ice, and a previous wireless operator for the ship, Mr. Faucusson, would later write that the ship was built almost like an icebreaker. She had a rounded bow and an almost flat bottom so that she could slide up on the ice rather than become stuck in it. The downside to this build was that, in rough sea, everyone could feel the ship get tossed around, and she drifted much more than a ship with a more conventional keel. The 3,081-ton steel steamer had a career that showcased her versatility. She carried passengers and cargo between New York, Halifax, and St. John's, but she was also used for sealing during the spring off-seasons, which was when she made most of her money. In 1914, she had cemented her name in the public mind by being hired to transport the first draft of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, the first 500, who sailed for England on the Florizel at the start of World War I. She would serve as a transport several times after this, carrying more troops to England as the war continued. She was a ship that could be trusted. In 1918, the Florizel was still described as the largest and best-known ship in the mercantile marine of Newfoundland. On the 23rd of February, at around 8 p.m., the Florizel departed from St. John's on a routine voyage that was scheduled to take her from St. John's to Halifax, and then on to New York. On board, she had 76 passengers, 60 crew members, and 12,000 barrels of cargo, mostly fish products. She was sailing under the command of Captain William Martin, who had been in command of the ship for some time, and had been with the Red Cross Line for even longer. The majority of the officers who were under his command for the voyage were also described as experienced men who had sailed with the line for some time. The passengers included the managing director of the Red Cross Line, J.S. Munn, and his young 3-year-old daughter, Betty. As the ship left St. John's, there was no warning of what was to come. It was a fairly clear night until about an hour after leaving port, when the ship was suddenly buffeted by a blinding snowstorm and a gale coming from the southeast. With this storm, visibility also dropped down so badly that the lookouts on the ship could hardly see ahead of the ship. Still, the Florizel was a ship with a good reputation. The crew seemed to be taking the precautions needed for a safe voyage, and Captain Martin had made the voyage enough that the passengers all went to their beds for the night, without too much apparent alarm. Captain Martin did his part to reassure everyone that he had no concerns about the conditions that they now found themselves in. One passenger, Captain Keene, an experienced captain in his own right, was concerned enough to find Captain Martin around 4 a.m, but again, Captain Martin stated that there was no danger and everything was fine. At 4:50 in the morning of Sunday, the 24th, all of the passengers were suddenly jolted awake by a horrifying shudder that shook the entire ship. All across the ship, the people who had been sleeping below decks were thrown out of their berths to the deck. Once they got up, they rushed to find out what had happened. No one had any doubt that it was something terrible. Many of the people who rushed to the deck did not even bother to get fully dressed. Through the night, the conditions had not been enough to make Captain Martin order any reduction in his speed. The passengers also noted in their accounts that it had seemed as though the ship was still making good time in spite of the weather conditions. Therefore, after 9 hours, Captain Martin could only suppose that he had cleared Cape Race, and ordered his ship's course to be changed to a westward direction. Visibility was still so low that he could only navigate based on the distance that he had calculated they had traveled while going the speed that he had ordered. This, too, was not too unusual according to Farquharson, who said that the run from Halifax to St. John's was almost always made in a heavy fog, and the trip was often made through a combination of dead reckoning and taking regular soundings. He added that Captain Martin seemed to know the depth of the sea at every inch between Halifax and St. John's. On this occasion, it proved to be a fatal miscalculation. The ship was already close to land when he gave the order, and shortly after, the first shock that had alarmed the passengers came. The ship then made 3 or 4 more lunges forward, each time causing the ship to shudder violently. She finally came to rest with her bow driven hard up on a rocky reef, and with a list to starboard. Heavy waves from the stormy sea began to break over the ship, breaking pieces of her superstructure off. This was the scene that met the passengers as they reached the deck. 200 yards away or so, they could see a beach, but in such cold and stormy conditions, trying to make it to land offered no one any hope. One of the passengers, named Gardner, would say that it took about 5 minutes to realize that they were wrecked at Horn Head, near Broad Cove. There was no thought of lifeboats, though. It seemed far too unlikely that any of them would survive the launching and voyage. The passengers began to try to make their way across the slanted deck, with the waves crashing over to the bow of the ship, where it seemed as though it might be safer. Soon after the Florizel settled on the rocks, the waves crashing over her carried away the wheelhouse and the smoking room. Many people were lost in this way, including Captain Keene, who had already broken his leg. His concern about the ship's safety had proven to be correct. Most of the saloon-class passengers had sought refuge in the smoking room, and they were taken away in an instant. Among their number was Mr. Munn, the managing director of the Red Cross line, and his daughter. Her nanny had never even managed to reach the deck, having been trapped in her bunk when the water started flooding in. Among those who were lost when the wheelhouse was carried away was not Captain Martin. It was found that Captain Martin had not been on the bridge when the ship had wrecked, in spite of the poor conditions that she was sailing in. The ship's saloon offered shelter, but many of the passengers did not feel safe there due to the rivers of water that were running through it, and tried to make it across the deck, the slanted deck, which was constantly being hit by heavy seas, and awash with debris was a dangerous gauntlet to cross, and many people were hit heavily, either by the waves or pieces of the ship, which was breaking apart, that they were knocked unconscious and swept overboard. Among the people who made the trip across the deck were a woman, Kitty Cantwell, and her friend Annie Dalton, who were making the trip to New York. Annie Dalton had been seasick the entire voyage, and in her weakened state, Kitty Cantwell did everything she could to help support her friend across the deck. A young man passed near the two women, and Kitty Cantwell called to him for help. He simply replied that he could not help her and kept on his own fight towards the bow of the ship. Shortly afterward, a large wave struck the ship, and Annie Dalton, who could not hold on, was swept overboard. Kitty Cantwell finished her trip across the deck on her hands and knees until she was able to reach the Marconi room. The Marconi room offered a rare place of shelter on the battered ship. It stood in the shelter of the smokestack, since the waves were washing from port to starboard. The ship's smokestack and masts held on strong despite the pounding waves, as did the forecastle. Kitty Cantwell was joining a majority of the other survivors on board the ship in the Marconi house. 32 people managed to cram into the small room. Among their number was also pantry waiter John Johnston, who had seen a woman named Minnie Denif being swept overboard, and had pulled her to safety by catching a hold of her hair. Kitty Cantwell would never manage to identify the young man who had refused to offer such help to her and her friend, and there was no knowing if he was among those who survived. Though the waves could not reach the people sheltering in the Marconi house, the door had been smashed to pieces by the waves, and the people in the room were forced to endure the wet and the cold. The same was true across the ship, and people began to succumb to exposure where they had managed to grab a hold of rigging and hide in the wreckage. This also included one of the men who had managed to reach the shelter of the Marconi house. As crowded as the room was, the people in the Marconi house were forced to lay his remains on the deck and allow them to be carried away by the waves. Every square inch in the safe haven was too precious to spare. The wireless apparatus itself, though, was entirely useless. After the initial message to the shore, the waves had destroyed all means of connecting to the outside world. For the people on shore who could see the wreck, it was also an anxious time. Early in the morning, a boat had tried to go from the shore to the wreck to save people, but they had not gone far before they were swamped by the waves. Luckily, everyone had survived the attempt, but no one tried it again. Wireless messages began to be sent to St. John's and Halifax. Cargo and the remains of people began to wash on shore, and there were no signs of life that could be spotted from the shore by the night of the 24th. They had managed to fire a rocket with a line to the ship, but no one had come for it, probably because no one on the ship had seen it or could reach it, though those on shore did not know this. Messages saying there were no survivors even put a pause on rescue efforts, but then a light was seen, and the urgency to reach the ship was also renewed. A series of messages had made it clear to everyone involved that if there was to be a rescue, it was going to have to be from the sea. Those on land could see no way forward. Several steamships stood nearby, but they could not get close to the Florizel because of how close to shore she was, without putting themselves in danger. The Prospero sent 3 lifeboats to try to come alongside the ship in the darkness, and they came within a few yards, but they were forced to turn back to their ship. The sea was still too angry, and there was a strong chance of their destruction if they got closer to the ship. The people in the Marconi house were deeply anxious by now. The small structure had survived for a day, but there was a chance that any wave could finally carry it away, and they might share the fate of the people who had been in the smoking room and wheelhouse. They could see the rescue steamers, the Home, the Britain, the Gordon C, the Hawk, the Prospero, and the Terra Nova standing nearby, though, and it was enough to give them hope. It was noted by the people who had sheltered in the Marconi room that Third Officer Jackman, who had been badly injured with his nose and upper lip split in half and some of his teeth knocked out, had still managed to contribute greatly to keeping up everyone's spirits and not letting people give up hope of rescue. Very few of the people in the Marconi room were not injured in some way. Those who had managed to not be smashed by waves and debris were instead beginning to suffer from frostbite or were in bad states of shock. Finally, as dawn broke on the morning of the 25th, the seas finally became a little more calm, and the boats from the rescue steamers that had been standing by were finally able to reach the starboard side of the steamer and begin to take people off. Captain Perry of the Gordon C was the first to reach the wreck, with the aid of a single seaman on a small dory. They managed to take the only 2 female survivors off first, and then returned 3 more times to try to rescue more people. On the 4th trip, the still rough seas overturned the dory, and the 2 men were almost knocked out. They were able to be saved, but it put an end to their rescue efforts. Another one of the boats made the dangerous trip 5 times before becoming swamped. Again, everyone survived, but it was a reminder to everyone of the dangerous work. Captain Dalton, who had been part of the rescue efforts, had several of his ribs broken while trying to board the Florizel. In all, it was agreed that the people leaving the Florizel had done so in an orderly fashion. The people in the Marconi room were not the only ones saved either. It was found that 4 men had found shelter in the oiler room under the forecastle, and had spent a miserable 27 hours with no food, water, or light, and no source of warmth, with only the sound of the waves beating on the hull for company. Another man, a passenger, had spent all day in the number 2 stateroom. Though badly frostbitten, he was described as being perfectly calm when they found him. Captain Martin was the last man who left his ship, one of only 44 to survive the disaster out of 138 who had left St. John's. As the ships took on the survivors, they all began to quickly turn to St. John's, where hospital beds and beds in the Sailors' Institute were being prepared already. Captain Martin was in no condition to face newspaper reporters when he arrived in St. John's, which led to initial rumors that, due to the ship being often used for transport troops, the ship's compass had been tampered with by a spy. It could not be believed that someone with so much experience as Captain Martin would make such a mistake. Soon, the blame would all find its way to Captain Martin, though. Despite what the former wireless operator of the ship, Faucasson, would write about Captain Martin always taking soundings, it was found that on the night of the 23rd into the 24th, he had not. It was suspected by the Marine Court that a strong polar current had slowed the ship down without Captain Martin realizing it, causing the ship to not be where he thought they were when he changed course. Captain Martin was found solely responsible for the accident, and his certificate was suspended for 21 months. In light of Captain Martin's long and successful career, though, he was allowed a chief's mate certificate through his suspension. There were also mutterings about Captain Martin having been drinking, and even Faucasson, who clearly felt that none of the crew would have done anything wrong, admitted that Captain Martin was known to take frequent nips at a bottle on long nights of fog to keep himself going. It was suspected by some that this very habit might have been why he had not been in the wheelhouse when the tragic accident occurred. It was also rumored that Captain Martin had known that a storm was coming, but the managing director of the line, Munn, had insisted on departing anyway because he was eager to reach New York, and from there the warmth of Florida. It was not until some time later that Third Officer Jackman made a new allegation. Yes, Captain Martin had ordered full speed ahead. But Chief Engineer Reeder, who had not survived the wreck, had not followed the order and had reduced the speed of the ship deliberately in the hopes that their arrival in Halifax would be delayed so that they would spend the night in Halifax. He had a motive to do this. His family lived there, and according to Jackman, he hoped to be able to spend more time with them. It was a shocking allegation for many. Reeder had been with the Red Cross line for 25 years and had a good reputation. What the truth of the story is will never be known, but the heavy cost of human life is. At the Mount Carmel Cemetery in St. John's, a monument was erected for all those who had been lost, and in 1925, a statue of Peter Pan was erected in Bowring Park, in memory of Betty Munn. For more information, please see the Joplin News Herald from February 26, 1918, or see our other sources in the description below. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.